Hello there. My name is Dr. Verlage, and I am going to give another presentation today for this series on perinatal mental health. So today's presentation is titled Why Early Intervention Matters, Preventing Intergenerational Transmission of Mental Health Risks. So I will give you a heads up that today's presentation is very biology heavy, so apologies in advance, but maybe this has to do with, I have my undergrad is in human evolutionary biology, so a lot of this kind of stuff. So yes, I hope you brought your bio brains to today. So let's jump in. All right, so we'll start very, very fundamentals and basics. DNA, it's in all of our cells, and it's how our genes or how our genetic material is translated into proteins. We are made up of proteins, all the parts of our bodies made up of proteins. The way that those proteins get made is that, and I won't go way back to describe what DNA is, but that those sequences are what get used to create the proteins that make us. For today, that could be different, receptors in our brain. It could be different hormonal systems. There's really so many ways that, these differences in how these proteins get made, how many get made, how quickly they get made, can translate to, even down the road, how we think, behaviors. Another piece that is relevant to today are these parts of those chromosomes. Chromosomes are the X that you would classically think of. That's the DNA all wound up together. That DNA gets wound up around these little balls called histones. If you let DNA, if you just stretched it out, it would be incredibly long, just not manageable. So the way that they get compacted is around these little balls. The problem is that when it's tightly bound around these little balls, they can't get translated, like we were talking about. And translation is how it actually makes proteins. Those balls can get loosened up. As you see, there's like these little pentagons where when those things change, the balls loosen up, the protein gets exposed, as you can see in that second picture, and then DNA transcription can actually happen. Those proteins can get produced. So you can imagine those balls, letting go and keeping tight is going to have lots of downstream effects of what actually gets translated, what proteins actually get made. And I will come back to this, principle as we move further a little bit in today's presentation. All right, so another biological principle for us to talk about before we move on is probably something you've heard about, seen about, the HPA axis. Cortisol is the end part of that axis. Most hormones are regulated in a, kind of checks and balances kind of way, where one hormone will affect the next hormone, which will release the ultimate hormone that makes a difference, but that will come back to the top and it'll maintain some kind of symbiosis through these systems. This system in particular is considered the stress response. There is the normal functioning of the HPA axis helps us regulate our day-to-day rhythms, our digestive systems. So it's not all bad. However, if you have a chronically elevated or active HPA axis where your cortisol is high too much of the time, it's getting that signal that it needs to be up, but then it does not come down, we know that that can lead to a lot of really negative health outcomes. I listed some here: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, depression, anxiety, weight gain, impaired immune function, digestive problems. So overall, we know not a good thing to have going off all the time and chronically elevated. Okay, so now let's actually loop back to, more biology. This is where we're getting closer to our topic for today, is thinking about perinatal women and this kind of intergenerational transmission of different issues. So this was a landmark concept study or finding in evolutionary biology and just, and medicine in general, where they have these, they do experiments on mice, you all know this, but they find that there's different caring behaviors that mother mice will have for their babies, and that can very much, there's good mouse parenting and bad mouse parenting. A good mother mouse or a attentive mother mouse will shape her body position in a very specific way that enables babies to breastfeed. And it also, a big behavior is licking. When they lick their babies a lot, that's considered high quality maternal care. Now, there are also mothers who do less of these behaviors. That's considered not ideal parenting. So what they did is they took these mothers and their babies, and they saw what happened to the babies who weren't cared for as well. And they followed them for when they were mothers. How did they behave as parents? And what they found was the babies who were with mothers that were not as attentive ultimately ended up being parents who were not as attentive. And so, how did they track that, the licking actually, which I didn't mention before, but when baby mice get this attention, as adults, there's positive health outcomes. They're more social, they're more comfortable, they're less anxious. So you might say, but that might be all genetic. Maybe they're just giving over the gene and that gene gets passed on to the baby. When they switch babies, so babies that came from mothers who were not good parents, they took them right at birth and gave them to a mother mouse that was an attentive parent. Those babies ended up being attentive parents. So, it was not purely genetic. And this is where those blue diagrams on the side, they're probably too small to read, but what they're explaining is that licking behavior that the mother would have towards babies early on helps with the histone release. So it's called DNA demethylation, helps with the balls releasing the DNA so DNA can actually get transcribed. We won't go too much into detail about that, but they do know that, again, it releases it. Certain genes actually get transcribed in these babies versus the babies who do not have that happen. Those genes don't get translated. And what this means for the adult baby is negative health outcomes if that doesn't happen, positive health outcomes if those behaviors from the mother did happen. So here's this very interesting place where, nature and nurture are directly overlapping. So it's not as simple as one gene to the next generation, but the gene might be there, but is it being translated? So you can imagine that this intergenerational transmission of, one parent or say a child doesn't get parenting that's ideal for many different reasons, busy parents, sick parents, just not an ideal setting, then they don't get certain proteins expressed. And then when they're a parent, they're less able to be, they're less able to do that for their child. So then you see how this would progress generation by generation and predispose each one to the negative outcomes we don't want to see. So let's see what we have next. So now that we've got all the biology under our belt, let's look at some specific studies that look at mothers' stress, anxiety, depression, and how it affects their children, who they followed till they were adolescents or adults. We have multiple studies that show this. I'm going to go over a few today. And again, the idea is that either in utero or after birth, there are long-term consequences, potential consequences to what happens specifically during that time period, which, ties back to the biology we talked about of certain genes getting expressed or not, depending on what exposures they get, in this case, maternal care, and how that translates down the road in their life. So let's jump into the first study. So this study was done by Van de Berg, and he was looking specifically at maternal anxiety during pregnancy, and then if that affected depression in children. So he showed that higher maternal anxiety at especially weeks of gestations between 12 and 22, that was associated with higher cortisol levels in their children later at age 15. So many, many years later, those 15-year-olds had higher cortisol. We talked about that. Chronically elevated cortisol has negative outcomes, health outcomes, and psychiatric outcomes. So it is interesting that just a subjective anxiety scale could lead to, and during pregnancy, led to this outcome 15 years later. And let's see, another point they made in that in female adolescents, this early exposure to maternal anxiety was also linked to an increased risk of depression symptoms. So interesting that it's female. I don't know why that would be specific to that. But higher depression scales for females, higher cortisol levels for all of them. And this was all related to anxiety scales during pregnancy. All right. So then this other study looked at the impact of maternal depression. So the other one was anxiety. This one looked at maternal depression on adolescent depression. So they looked at, they did the Edinburgh scales. We've talked about that in previous lectures. But 11% had scores that were suggestive of depression. That was during pregnancy. It was actually less, which I think is maybe not the norm, but they saw depression more often during pregnancy, and then 7% postnatally or postpartum. And then, so in the study, children of mothers with antenatal depression, so during pregnancy, had an increased odds ratio of depression at age 18. So it looks like they found more of a correlation for in utero exposure than postnatal with these long-term age 18 outcomes for risk of depression. All right. So the increased risk of adolescent depression associated with antenatal depression was independent of later exposure to maternal depression. So it looks like they were also watching if mom got depressed, later during that kid's life, and that didn't seem to predispose them to depression in adulthood like during pregnancy depression did. And then I thought this was interesting that there seemed to be a dose effect where the higher the depression scale mom had during pregnancy, the higher the risk the child / later adult would become, the higher the risk that they would become depressed. Okay, so what this study suggests is that there's different pathways for, pregnancy and postpartum depression and increasing the risk of depression or issues in the offspring. Postnatal depression seemed to be Yeah, so this is where I think the study gets interesting. So the postnatal depression seemed to be lessened, like there seemed to be a relationship between postnatal depression and education. Seemed if the woman was educated and she had postnatal depression, her risk was lower than, say, somebody who had postnatal depression and a lower education. Versus, it did not matter if during pregnancy, if the woman's education was high or low, the risk of depression later on in life was the same. So, how this study interpreted that was women who are educated probably have more access to resources. So, help for taking care of baby postpartum, that's a big one. Resources, money to take care of these babies. They would, again, probably have more of an ability to mitigate their depression with external factors to take care of the baby. So that's why they think that education level was protective for postpartum women and their babies from becoming depressed, versus, say, somebody who is a lower education level probably has access to less resources, less family members that can help, less babysitters who can come, less finances to get all the things to take care of babies. So that baby was more exposed to those depressive symptoms or the effects of mom being depressed than otherwise. And so down the road, they had a higher risk for depression. But pregnancy, the higher education / all the resources that usually means don't mean much. There's the uterus, right? So education wasn't protective for those babies when it was in utero. That cortisol stress response is going to be the same for your high-powered, executive mom who's under a ton of stress and works all day, and having those spikes in high levels of cortisol versus, say, mom working 3 jobs trying to make ends meet, that physiologically feels this or looks similar. So those babies had similar rates of depression down the road. And that speaks to what, again, in this study, how they interpreted it was there's a little more biology at play and epigenetics at play during pregnancy than postpartum, where, there's more environmental I should say epigenetics. There's more biologically based principles during pregnancy and more, environmental factors that are at play, postpartum. So it's an interesting study, helpful for us to understand and think about these things. I probably am going to be as aggressive treating depression, during pregnancy and postpartum, but definitely gives us some maybe reassurance that treating depression with medication during pregnancy is just as important as postpartum for those moms who say, but maybe I'll just wait till postpartum. Yeah, these in utero effects, there's a lot of biology there and does put babies at risk. Okay, so let's see what's next. A little more biology just so that we can talk about this last study. You recognize the X, those are chromosomes filled with DNA. There are little pieces that in this picture are blue that are at the end, and they're actually the end sequences of DNA. And they happen to sit at the bottom and tops of the chromosome, of the arms of the chromosome. And what those are they're actually empty DNA. They don't translate for anything. However, every time that your DNA gets translated to another chromosome, how it replicates, that shortens. So a little bit of DNA is lost every time that happens. And having longer telomeres can be protective against, it becoming too short. So we think of more telomere associated with younger age and overall health. Okay, let's see here. So those are telomeres. So one study looked at telomere length and familial risk for depression. So this study was done where they looked at the telomere length in girls aged 10 to 14 and who were at a high risk of depression. That is, their mothers had a history of depression. So girls in the high risk group had significantly shorter telomeres. So these girls have never been depressed, or they might have been depressed, but they weren't selecting them based on if they'd had or had not had depression themselves. Their mothers had been depressed. They took a group, they found the ones whose mothers had been depressed, and they looked at the telomere length. And those telomeres were shorter than the other group. And again, longer telomeres are protective. So let's see what they say next. So that in and of itself, again, negative health outcomes. It's a way for us to explain these negative health outcomes that can come from, exposure from mother. Okay, let's see. So then on top of the just shorter telomere length, it also found that those with the shorter telomeres also had a greater cortisol reactivity when they put them in a stress test. So their cortisol spiked more than their peers, which again, we've talked cortisol long-term high is not good. Okay. So just another way, the next step of one way that a shorter telomere might cause health issues down the road. So I know, again, that was a lot of biology. I think the biology obviously is really helpful for us to understand how, people can just inherently be at more risk. And that, so they're at more risk, how this intergenerational pattern happens. But I hope with the takeaway that there is a lot of hope. If we can break that cycle, help moms fight the biology of having higher cortisol responses, all these things, help them feel like themselves. So treat their depression and anxiety, get them the resources that they need to be present with their babies and caring for their babies, which is what they want. And that can help really affect a long, downstream effect. Baby gets all the care that it needs, all the love that it needs. That means that it's going to be set or better prepared to be that for its own child. And know that these helping mom while she's going through an episode, that is a direct, really important thing to do. But that's also going to affect baby when they're 15, 18 and down for their whole lives. So what we do really has a lot of impact on multiple lives and multiple generations. So, it's at least I, after kind of talking through this, feel really motivated to, do as much as we can, recognizing just how impactful our interventions can be for these moms. So yeah, that was today's presentation, and I'll see you at the next one.